Imagine a dimly lit ballroom where two figures glide across the floor. One is a marionette, its strings pulled by an unseen puppeteer labeled Washington, forced to mirror every movement with anxious precision. The other moves freely, cutting across the space with confident steps, listening only to its own rhythm. This is the story of two South Asian neighbors under the same global tariff storm. Pakistan, compelled by external strings, and India, asserting its own dance. In late July 2025, Washington dropped a 25% tariff bomb on Indian exports, an abrupt, sweeping levy that sent shockwaves through New Delhi's boardrooms and trade desks. The announcement, delivered via presidential tweet and reinforced in a terse White House statement, targeted key Indian sectors: textiles, pharmaceuticals, steel, and consumer goods. The stated rationale was to rectify an allegedly lopsided trade relationship and to leverage U.S. economic power in the broader contest with China. The world watched, expecting familiar patterns: India scrambling to placate Washington just as Pakistan had always done in similar crises. Pakistan's response was immediate and instinctive. Before the ink had dried on the tariff bulletin, Islamabad's finance minister was already in frantic discussions with IMF officials in Washington. The promise of fresh disbursements, crucial for propping up foreign reserves, hinged on Pakistan's willingness to demonstrate compliance with U.S. demands. Karachi's stock exchange opened to plunging indices, traders rushing to hedge rupee positions and offload vulnerable assets. Within 24 hours, Pakistan's energy minister had quietly instructed negotiators to revisit long-term oil import agreements with Russia and Iran, fearing they might invoke U.S. secondary sanctions. The country's most senior military brass signaled readiness for enhanced base access pacts, suggesting the United States could station additional troops and pre-position equipment on Pakistani soil in exchange for a diplomatic reprieve. The impression on the global stage was clear: Pakistan would bend to maintain the relationship. Every policy decision, every foreign policy tilt, had to pass through the filter of U.S. approval. Whether Islamabad intended it or not, it was dancing to Washington's tune. New Delhi, by contrast, did something radically different. Instead of panic, there was pause, a strategic breath taken before action. Prime Minister Modi convened a small circle of economic and foreign policy advisors behind closed doors. No cameras, no public statements, no overt pleas for leniency. That restraint itself sent a message: India was not a client state. 4 days after the tariff announcement, Modi spoke at the G20 summit, addressing world leaders in the press gallery. He framed the tariffs as a test of equitable treatment among partners. Reciprocity, fairness, and non-discrimination must govern our trade ties, he said. The tone was firm but measured, a reminder that India remained committed to global trade rules and expected them to be applied evenly. Behind the scenes, India's ambassador to Washington quietly engaged key members of Congress and senior administration officials, emphasizing India's contributions to regional security, its role in supplying pharmaceuticals during the pandemic, and its partnership in critical minerals supply chains. Within days, whispers emerged of carve-outs. Certain categories of Indian exports would be exempted or subject to reduced levies. While the final list was narrower than India had hoped, it represented a significant concession from an administration known for its tariff zeal. In Mumbai, the news was met with relief and opportunity. Exporters in the textile hubs of Gujarat and Tamil Nadu saw new orders trickling in, as U.S. importers scrambled to lock in supplies before tariffs took full effect. Pharmaceutical executives announced plans to reroute shipments through bonded warehouses and prepay import duties, smoothing the transition. Stock analysts revised their forecasts upward for companies with significant U.S. exposure. By contrast, in Karachi, the mood remained tense. Pakistan's central bank intervened to defend the rupee, burning through precious foreign reserves. The finance minister publicly appealed for expedited IMF support, warning that economic stability, hung in the balance. This public display of vulnerability only reinforced the image of Pakistan as a country beholden to outside powers. The unfolding events offered a master class in the doctrine of strategic autonomy versus the reality of aid dependency. Pakistan's policy calculus was driven by the precious need for liquidity, its foreign exchange reserves, barely sufficient to cover 2 months of imports. The IMF, itself under pressure from Washington, conditioned disbursements on strict austerity measures, cuts to energy subsidies, tightening of fiscal spending, and enhanced oversight by external advisors. Every compliance report submitted to the IMF got relayed back to U.S. policymakers, further tightening Washington's grip on Islamabad's decision-making. The perception grew among Pakistani elites and the public alike that sovereignty was conditional, that Pakistan could not deviate from U.S. preferences without risking financial collapse. India, on the other hand, parlayed its vast domestic market and diversified partnerships into genuine negotiating leverage. With over 1.4 billion consumers and a fast-growing middle class, India could withstand temporary trade shocks far more easily than Pakistan. It had multiple sources of energy and raw materials: hydrocarbons from the Middle East, coal from Australia, lithium from Latin America, which meant it could absorb tariff pain and find alternatives without crippling its economy. Its external debt to GDP ratio hovered well below crisis levels, giving New Delhi room to respond flexibly. India's foreign reserves exceeded $600 billion, providing an enormous buffer against currency shocks. This fiscal strength became the cornerstone of its diplomatic stance, refusing to beg for exemptions, but insisting on fair treatment, with or without special favors. The market response underscored these differences. In the weeks following the tariff rollout, Mumbai's benchmark indices outperformed most Asian peers, buoyed by sectors poised to benefit from a partial relocation of supply chains away from China. Manufacturing firms accelerated plans to expand capacity, while logistics companies touted the potential for increased freight through Indian ports. Meanwhile, in Karachi, the stock market languished near 6-month lows, weighed down by investor fears of cascading economic measures. Stories of looming load shedding and foreign exchange shortages dominated local headlines, reinforcing the narrative that Pakistan's fate was tied to Washington's whims. Beyond the immediate economics, the episode revealed a deeper theater of perception. Pakistani state media and political commentators fixated on the external origins of their crisis. "America's tariff trap" was a common refrain. Opposition parties used it to batter the government, claiming that Islamabad had failed to diversify its alliances. This public discourse, however, rarely turned inward to question the wisdom of aid dependency or the absence of indigenous policy levers. The idea that Pakistan could stand up to pressure on its own merits rarely gained traction. In India, media narratives celebrated a different theme: resilience through autonomy. Op-eds highlighted how India had weathered global shocks, the pandemic, supply chain disruptions, and emerged stronger. Journalists praised the balanced approach, firm objection to punitive measures, combined with pragmatic engagement to secure carve-outs. Commentators noted that India's refusal to capitulate had drawn international respect, bolstering its claims for a permanent seat on the UN Security Council and greater leadership in forums like the G20, BRICS, and the Quad. Meanwhile, policymakers in capitals from Brasilia to Jakarta watched closely. Brazil saw in India a model for resisting unilateral U.S. economic pressure without resorting to brinkmanship. Asian nations, wary of having to choose between Washington and Beijing, noted India's ability to maintain strong ties with both superpowers. Japan and Australia, deepening their own partnerships with India to balance China, applauded New Delhi's demonstration that strategic autonomy was not only possible, but advantageous. Back in Islamabad, interim measures to placate Washington began to strain domestic politics. Legislation was introduced to tighten anti-money laundering frameworks and expand surveillance of financial transactions, moves demanded by the Financial Action Task Force under U.S. influence. Opposition politicians accused the government of selling out national privacy and sovereignty, fueling protests. Street demonstrations erupted in Lahore as subsidies on basic commodities were slashed to satisfy IMF budget targets. The public confronted a stark choice: accept austerity to stay in America's good graces or risk losing critical financial lifelines. New Delhi's path remained markedly different. The central government announced targeted stimulus for industries hurt by partial tariffs, financed by modest relocations from non-essential capital projects. Social welfare schemes continued unaffected, preserving consumer confidence. India's External Affairs Ministry quietly arranged a fresh energy security pact with Gulf producers, securing spot market purchases of crude oil at discounted rates, reducing reliance on any single supplier, and insulating the economy from price shocks. These moves demonstrated to both domestic and international audiences that India's decision-making was sovereign, neither dictated by Washington nor bent by coercion. As summer turned to autumn, the ripple effects of the tariff drama extended beyond bilateral ties. Multilateral negotiations on global trade rules, stalled for years, found new momentum. India leveraged its G20 presidency ambitions to push for reforms that would limit the unilateral use of tariffs as geopolitical tools. While this agenda faced resistance, it resonated with many emerging market nations tired of being caught in great power crossfires. In Islamabad, however, no such higher-order debates took place. The conversation remained mired in reactive crisis management: how to secure the next IMF tranche, how to placate Washington's security concerns, how to avoid further rating downgrades by credit rating agencies, influenced by U.S. perspectives. The concept of using the tariff episode to drive structural reforms, diversifying exports, building domestic resilience, crafting independent foreign policy strategies, rarely surfaced in serious policy circles. This divergence in strategic vision highlighted a fundamental truth: sovereignty is not a static declaration, it is a practice capability. India's ability to say no to punitive measures, to negotiate on its own terms, and to marshal its internal resources for resilience, became the hallmark of a rising power confident in its place on the world stage. Pakistan's reflexive compliance, born of fiscal desperation and security dependencies, underscored the challenges faced by smaller states in a system where aid and alliance come with unspoken strings. By early 2026, the longer-term impacts were crystallizing. Pakistan's growth forecasts were repeatedly downgraded, unemployment rates crept upward, and its foreign exchange reserves fell below critical thresholds. Public sentiment turned increasingly toward questioning the value of external bailouts that demanded painful domestic cuts. Calls for a more independent foreign policy grew, ironically, spurred by the very crisis that had demonstrated how constrained Pakistan's freedom really was. India's economy, meanwhile, continued its steady ascent. Foreign direct investment surged into manufacturing parks in Gujarat and Andhra Pradesh, as global firms sought alternatives to China. Service sector exports, e.g., finance, professional services, expanded into new markets, bolstered by inked agreements in Africa and Latin America. India's balance of payments remained strong, and its fiscal deficit was contained within manageable limits. These outcomes were not mere chance. They reflected deliberate policy choices underpinned by the conviction that India would not be held hostage by external pressures. The final act of this tariff tango played out not on the stock tickers or the newspapers, but in the realm of ideas. Universities in Delhi and Karachi hosted seminars on strategic autonomy. Think tanks in Islamabad produced reports on the perils of aid dependency, largely ignored by policymakers, and called for reforms that would break the cycle of conditionality. Indian academic forums, by contrast, debated the country's evolving role as a global balancer, how to maintain ties with the United States, deepen partnerships with Russia and the Gulf, and lead coalitions of the global South in crafting fairer rules for trade and security. On that ballroom floor, the puppet continued to dance, its strings pulled by impulses not its own, while the free dancer moved on, shaping her own choreography. The contrast could not have been clearer. Pakistan, bound by necessity, and India, unbound by choice. And in that contrast lay the lesson of the 25% tariff. True sovereignty is not given. It is earned in the ability to withstand pressure without capitulating, to turn a crisis into an opportunity, and to chart one's own course, even when the music changes unexpectedly. When the final curtain fell on this chapter, the world saw more than a tariff dispute. It witnessed a defining moment in South Asia's power dynamics, a moment when one nation reaffirmed its autonomy, and another saw its strings tighten ever more. The real question now is whether Pakistan can learn a new choreography, one that breaks free of external commands, or whether it will remain forever the marionette in someone else's show. As for India, the dance continues, guided by its own rhythm, and watched by the world as a master class in strategic confidence. The final movement of this geopolitical ballet unfolds not in grand gestures, but in quiet transformations that ripple far beyond South Asia's shores. As the dust settled on the tariff clash, the true victory revealed itself in the choices each country could, and ultimately could not make. Pakistan, still tethered to external lifelines, found itself locked in a familiar cycle: borrow, comply, adjust, survive. Each loan was both lifeline and leash, cutting deeper into the autonomy it so desperately craved. The IMF's conditions, negotiated under Washington's watchful eye, dictated fiscal and policy reforms that stiffened Pakistan's backbone in theory, but hollowed it out in practice. Leaders struggled to sell austerity at home, even as they bowed to demands abroad. Protests flared and then faded, replaced by the abiding resignation that survival meant submission. India's story was almost the mirror opposite. Faced with the same tariff shock, it leaned on robust reserves, diversified energy sources, and a market large enough to cushion jolts. In resisting blanket concessions, India did not act out of stubborn pride, but out of calculated self-interest, signaling to global investors that its decisions would be made in New Delhi, not Washington. By converting crisis into opportunity, it expedited plans to strengthen domestic manufacturing, fast-track infrastructure projects, and cultivate new trade corridors with Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. Partners once hesitant to shift supply chains from China now saw India, not merely as an alternative, but as a preferred destination for reliable rule-based commerce. What transpired in the months that followed went beyond statistics and balance sheets. It shaped perceptions of credibility and trust. For Pakistan, the narrative of a sovereign state capable of independent decision-making remained elusive. Each policy reversal under external pressure reinforced a public sense of powerlessness. Even well-meaning reforms were tainted by the suspicion that they were imposed rather than chosen. In polite diplomatic circles, whispers circulated that engaging with Pakistan meant negotiating not with Islamabad, but with the interests of distant capitals. In contrast, India's negotiating table attracted new voices. European Union envoys approached with proposals for digital trade agreements. Gulf investors explored joint venture energy hubs. Multilateral lenders offered low-interest packages to support green technology and port modernization, not as lifelines contingent on political strings, but as investments in a stable partner. India's refusal to capitulate to punitive tariffs had cost it some immediate revenue, yet it earned far greater returns in strategic goodwill. That goodwill, unlike short-term aid, is not easily revoked. The broader lesson echoed across emerging markets: strategic autonomy matters. Countries watched as India leveraged its size, its democratic institutions, and its diversified partnerships to maneuver through a superpower dispute. They noted that while no nation is entirely immune to external shocks, developing buffers, fiscal, diplomatic, and institutional, turn potential crises into exercises in resilience. The idea of a sovereign nation being forced into policy reversals by foreign creditors felt not like an anomaly, but like a cautionary tale. Pakistan's plight served as a stark warning of the perils of overdependence, even on allies. Back in Islamabad, murmurs for a rethink grew louder. Some argued for greater outreach to regional neighbors, China, Turkey, Malaysia, to dilute reliance on any single patron. Others crafted blueprints for boosting domestic revenue through tax reform, hoping to break the cycle of bailout dependence. Young economists and civil society activists began advocating a more assertive foreign policy stance, one that would eschew reactive postures in favor of negotiated balances. Yet turning these ideas into reality required both political will and room to maneuver, two commodities in short supply, when every major decision demanded external approval. In New Delhi, policymakers reflected on their own moment of choice. The tariff episode reaffirmed a long-standing conviction that India must continue building the capacities that underpin genuine autonomy. This meant not only growing foreign reserves and diversifying partnerships, but also strengthening domestic institutions, rule of law, fiscal discipline, transparent governance, so that policy choices are respected, not second-guessed. The dance with Washington had ended not in capitulation, but in mutual recognition. The United States acknowledged India's indispensable role in regional security and global trade, while India reaffirmed that no relationship, however important, would compromise its decision-making authority. The final act of this saga is still being written. Pakistan stands at a crossroads, either to persist in the age-old dance of dependency, or to break free by cultivating the resilience that makes sovereignty more than a slogan. India, having cut its own strings, must now sustain the autonomy it fought for, guarding against complacency, and continuing to diversify its engagements. The rhythm of global politics will shift again. New tariffs, new disputes, new pressures will test each nation's capacity to choose its own path. Yet one thing is clear: the Tariff Tango of 2025 was more than a trade dispute. It was a dramatization of power in the modern era, where influence is measured not just by economic might, but by the freedom to elect without coercion. Pakistan's struggle illustrated the costs of dependency. India's response showcased the dividends of self-reliance. Both performances will be studied by scholars, debated by policy makers, and remembered by citizens seeking to understand the true meaning of sovereignty. As we leave the ballroom, the image of the two dancers lingers. One, still bound by strings, moving with hesitant obedience, each step a reminder of forces beyond its control. The other, liberated, drawing its own patterns across the floor, inviting the world to witness a choreography born of choice, confidence, and calculated resolve. The question for the future is simple: which dance will South Asia embrace? The one dictated by distant powers, or the one that emerges from the determined steps of its own people? Only time will tell, but the lesson of the Tariff Tango is already clear. True power lies not in the volume of one's steps, but in the freedom to choose them. Sources: Ask ChatGPT.